Welcome, everybody. So today we're going to do a webinar wow, so I hope everybody enjoys it. This is part of the NAGT webinar series, Improving Earth Education 1 hour at a time. Just a little background, if you've never used Zoom, just introduce you to some of the participant controls at the bottom. Hopefully, I think everybody has their video muted and their mics muted. Throughout the presentation, we will be using some of the controls that you can find located under the participant controls, right in the side of your screen, like raise hand, yes, no. And then also we'll be utilizing the chat function as well. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sean Tavalia. I'm the chair of NAGT's Professional Development Committee and also part of the webinar series committee too. Hopefully we'll get some good information. So for the webinar series, just so everybody knows, this is kind of a neat, or I shouldn't say new, but it's relatively new in terms of the series. We always had the webinars. But we introduced the webinar series to try to link together some of the other programs that we offer through NAGT and really produce a synergy between all of those programs. So the webinar series itself is really looking to provide some more topical webinars that deal with improving teaching, learning, diversity, equity, inclusion, engaging communities and society, implementing NGSS standards, strengthening your department, and supporting geoscience education. All of the programs at NAGT runs really well, and hopefully we get together in one series, bringing the linkages between all of those groups and programs into one full series of the webinars. So before we begin, I want to get a little acquainted with those on the webinar. And what I'd like you to do is you could just open the chat box and let us know the title or theme of the webinar you're planning to develop, if you are planning to develop. If you haven't thought about it yet, let me know a webinar title that you'd like to develop. I'll just give everybody a couple minutes to find the chat and type in a couple words. Great, the on-ramps and not sure, lots of ideas. Hopefully, as we go through this, some of those ideas will come together with some of the techniques might bring out some ideas of how you can go about bringing them to life. So while we're at it, let's go back to my slide here. So in that participant control box, raise your hand if you've been on a webinar. Excellent. While we're at it, and lower your hand if it's been an NAGT webinar. Never been. Excellent. Great. So what we're going to plan to do today is, one, help you develop a clear objective for a webinar, learn some of the best practices for webinar development, learn about the tools available in Zoom that will help you engage the participants, and also learn about the upcoming NAGT webinar programs. So for those of you who have a webinar already planned, I just wanted to go through some of the background items that we really require. And Andrew, you might jump in anytime as we go through this. As you're thinking about your webinar, we really need to get information as soon as possible from the presenters, especially up front, the title and the presenter names and affiliations, along with the summary of what you're planning to do and a short description. That's really the required material that Andrew needs to start developing the webinar page. And Andrew, if you want to chime in on terms of timing for that.
Really, kind of as soon as possible, once you've been able to identify when you're going to have the webinar, time, date, really, it just helps with promoting that webinar as soon as possible. And so it's always good to have it, if it's like in a series the way this is, if it's available at the beginning of the series, and you get that promotion all the way through. But really, probably 2 months out, we're thinking about like usually having all that stuff set and ready to go.
Okay. So there's a lot of things that happen behind the scenes in terms of getting the webinar series together. I always think it's a good idea to show that. I know when I was doing programs anywhere, I always get a little antsy about what should be happening and what needs to happen when it needs to happen. So just wanted to give you a little background of what happens behind the scenes, and usually who's doing what and when. And really the whole series, depending on the programming, starts a couple months ahead, and usually at least 2 months prior. The committee meeting, we're really working to develop who can be leading individual webinars and which webinars to present. And if that has gone well, and I think a couple of you, since you are presenting some webinars, know that eventually a committee member will reach out and ask you to present that webinar. At some point, usually about a month prior to it, what we're hoping that you'll do is really schedule a call with your other presenters to outline the talk and how to make the presentation interactive, which is what we're going to really talk about today in terms of making it a successful webinar. About 2 weeks prior to your webinar, really important thing to do is to set up a practice run. Best way to do that is to communicate with the committee member who suggested the webinar. Eventually, I have a feeling Andrew is probably going to be part of that as well to set up the actual call. It's going to be really important to do in terms of just figuring out who's doing what throughout the webinar, and also just to check to make sure all of the technical material is working correctly. It's not something you want to find out on the day of the webinar. And then just from the support staff, just seeing that the registration for the webinar closed about 2 days prior, and then the final announcement, as most of you have seen, comes out the day before and provides the participants and the presenters with the Zoom connection information and that comes from Andrew and the support staff. So one thing I'd like to do, and this is going to be a little tricky for some of you, if you have a smartphone or you can get to your internet connection, what I'd like you to do is just to go to this web address, https://pollev.com/TaveliaS. Probably best on your smartphone. It works up pretty easily. Once you get there, you'll get to a simple poll. And what I'd like you to do is just take a minute and think about a webinar or a workshop you've attended if you haven't been on a webinar. And think of one that you found that was ineffective. And in that poll, just start listing some words that come to mind that characterize that webinar. I'm going to give everybody a couple minutes just to navigate to that website. You can also text if you're on a smartphone. To text, all you would need is to send the words TaveliaS to 37607. You'll get a text right back that says you're now in the poll, and you can just submit words just by entering each word and texting it to that account. If you have any questions, just raise your hand and we'll go through that. And feel free to add as many words as you want as you go through that process. So I don't know if it's good or bad that we've all been in these bad webinars. And for the most part, it usually comes out to the same things, right? There's a lack of connection to the participants' work, non-interactive, non-engaging. Many times people are just reading, and not providing a real connection to everyday life. So what you're using now is poll everywhere, just another way of keeping people engaged. And I kind of like using the word cloud for this, just to really show that we've all been there, and we're all going to try not to do these things when we produce our webinars. So now, same idea. This time, let's think about the webinars or workshops that you've been through that you found very effective. What were the characteristics of those webinars? What made the webinars so useful to you, or useful to your job or to your work, or kept you engaged? Again, things that we've all shared, and if you've been to NAGT, these are the webinars or workshops. These are the things that we really try to do. And we want our workshops to be interactive. It's great to see how many people do that. If you're used to word clouds, right, the more the word shows up, the bigger it is in the word cloud and interactive, there it is. That's what we really want to see in any of the workshops or webinars that we put on. I think that's what really separates NAGT programs from a lot of the other programs that are out there. We really do engage our participants, make them as interactive as possible, and really allow our participants to leave with something useful at the end of the webinar or workshop. Great, thank you. So that's when we look at our general workshop or webinar design, really want to model this on any other workshop. The only difference is how we're presenting it, and it's the presentation mode that really, I think, will have everybody struggling at a regular workshop. It's that immediate feedback you get just by interacting in person with people. That's different from a webinar stage. We're interacting, obviously interacting, but not being able to really see the room or work individually with the people makes it a little difficult. But either way, what we want to try to do in all of our webinars is these three practices. We want to engage our participants throughout the entire webinar. And most importantly, we want to engage our participants from the very beginning, make them want to stay throughout the entire webinar, not make them want to work on something else throughout the program, and stay connected throughout the entire discussion. Once we have people engaged, it's just like being in our classroom. Then we want to really just repeat the final 2 parts. We want to provide our participants with materials and explanations, something that they can learn, something that is new, and then allow them an opportunity to reflect and apply, right? And then I always like to say it's the shampoo model, right? Rinse, wash, and repeat. Same thing here, learn, reflect, apply, repeat. And through that whole process, we hope to really keep the participants engaged and make it a very useful workshop. One of the issues that we deal with is how do you balance the learning and applying in a workshop setting. And we just wanted to throw some numbers out to give people a general idea of how much speaking versus how much discussing and working. For all of our workshops, try to plan on about 45 minutes of presenting, where you are actually discussing the topic and then allowing your participants at least 10 minutes throughout the entire process to work or discuss and apply what you've learned. Most importantly, when you're developing the workshop, really get a chance or think about the end minutes. All workshops or webinars are going to have 5 minutes towards the end for an evaluation. And you'll have that in this webinar as well. We'd like you to try to allow that time because we know, and I'm sure you know, once you leave, the chances of coming back and completing that evaluation are getting little and little. So if we do it in the last 5 minutes of the webinar, we'll just have the greatest return rate on those evaluations. So I want to show an example. This is an example of a webinar from just this past semester in the fall, September 12th, from NGSS, using NGSS to change worlds. And I just want to use this as an example as for engaging. And just a heads up before this starts, the sound on this might be a little loud, so you might want to adjust your speaker when it starts.
What we're here to talk about today is actually changing the world, and that's what we're going to look into. So before we get that started, I'm going to make you use the chat box so that you can't just sit and be multitasking next to your computer while we're doing this conversation. So I want you to type in sort of like just one word or phrases or things that are, stuff that, why are you a science teacher? Why do you care about Earth and space science? What is the why that's behind your commitment to be a part of this effort and this movement for kids? So if you could just shoot in, you don't have to like write a whole paragraph about all of it, but just like a phrase at a time, a sentence at a time, just kick those into the chat, and we'll I'll shout them out as they sort of come through, and we'll talk about those things a little bit, because I think it's really important to.
Yeah, sound was good.
Okay. Couldn't hear it on my end.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, it was great on our end.
Okay, good. So if you could, what I'd like you to do is just take a second, and I know it wasn't the complete area, but if you could just go into the chat box and tell me what you thought about how the speaker was engaging the participants and what was important in that process. And I'll just give everybody about a minute or so to respond and what they thought in terms of how that was valuable as a speaker to engage the audience right from the start. That's the very beginning of that webinar. So one of the things I liked most about that is really thinking about webinar development, just as we would any classroom experience or any workshop experience. Getting people involved really means appealing to the affective domain, right? Why are they interested? Why are they there? What do they hope to get out of it? And on top of that, I think the speaker does a great job of really just creating a group, right? Talking about how everybody's engaged and how important it is to everybody, and really getting that group dynamic going, which is great, right? Because now once you have your group dynamic, you know you're in the same area, and you're ready to start participating and seeing how everybody can add to the rest of that conversation as we keep moving forward. That's great. Well, I was just reading from Barb. The fact that he didn't like that it was forcing people to pay attention. And yeah, true. But at the same part, it's one of the things that we'd like to do is try to minimize how many people are paying attention to their other work and really focusing on the workshop. So with your webinar, as you start to develop and you're thinking about what you're going to be presenting, like I said, we're going to use this just like you would any normal classroom. Well, it's just a little less normal than a normal classroom, and really thinking about backward design. So we want to start off with what are our goals? What is the objective for developing your workshop? then once you understand what the objective for the workshop is, think about what kind of feedback and assessment you're going to use throughout the workshop. And what I mean by the feedback is, how will you engage your participants? What kind of material or activities will you have them do? And more importantly, how will they do it? Especially considering it's a webinar and you have very few items that you can use in terms of the Zoom tools or possibly even online material. You have a very limited time and you want to have that immediate feedback, be able to continue with the workshop, assess it as we go, and then continue moving forward so that everybody at the end reaches your objectives. And that's one of the more difficult items that you're going to have, is really understanding, once you know what your objective is, how do you get your participants to really engage in that in a meaningful way that allows them to apply what you're teaching, and also to see how they can use it in their own lives. So on that note, one more example, and again, you may have to adjust your volume. And in this case, we're going to look at an example from using GPS data to teach about the Earth in introductory undergraduate courses, plate tectonics, earthquakes, water cycle, and ice mass change. This is from the GETC folks and UNAVCO, and I believe you're going to hear Karen Quartz speaking.
Example of that. All right, so here's your first look at the GPS data that we used in this unit. So we have 3 different stations shown here, and each station has a north component, an east component, and a height component. So I'd like you to look at the first station, station SEAT, and look at the data that's showing you that that's presented there, and act like a student and figure out what direction that station is moving. So I think we'll have a poll up.
Yeah, do you want to, yep, okay.
Okay, and then, yeah, it looks like you can do them all at once. So you'll do this for each of the stations, each of the 3 stations presented. And I think you might need to move your little poll box out of the way so you can look at the stations behind there. Beth, I can see the box, by the way.
You can see the poll box?
That's a good question.
Oh,
For this
okay,
one,
awesome.
the participants have PDFs or docs on the screen.
So I'll give you about 30 more seconds to fill this in, or Beth might cut us off early, depending on how quickly we respond.
Explain that even more. We'll talk about what else they're seeing, and I'll let Andrew jump in just a second. The video is very small on my screen, but on a larger screen, it does come out full size. So if you go to this and actually view the webinar, the images are a little better to see than what you see here. And I'm going to pull up some of the materials that they're referring to, because this is
slowed down
one of the areas where you can use the polling.
So if you're seeing the poll, then
that's
Karen, I
available
think
in
people
the
should
Zoom
be able to see it.
platform.
So we have
just to see what
Northeast for seat, 93% of the people voted for that. We have Northwest for PKRD, 87% for that, and
So can you jump back to answering the question, just because right as you started answering, the video started playing?
Yeah, just back a little bit.
No, you could just re-say what you were answering, just because the video was playing right as you started answering. We couldn't hear both of them at the same time.
I'm sorry. So the question was, is the size of the materials, and did the participants have larger size formats? And what I was saying was, if you pull up the video from the webinar site, it looks a lot larger on the screen. They're seeing the actual size. It's just too small from this screen because it's a screen capture. And then in terms of the polls, this is the polling that we're looking at. Oh, sorry, go back one. So this is what's presented to the participants as they were asked the question to evaluate that. And I think at this point, Andrew, it might be a good point for you just to talk about the process of developing the poll.
Sure. So I can back up a little bit more. So right, the PDFs they didn't have the PDFs ahead of time, but they did have a link to the web page that hosts those materials. So they could have potentially had those materials in front of them if they wanted to. And really it comes down to, what are you trying to convey at that point? Do you really want them to be able to read through those PDFs at that very moment? Or are you just trying to illustrate a snapshot of what's available in those teaching materials, right? So it depends on what you're using that for. So as for the polls here, these are the polls that Zoom has built into its own system. And so you can do either a single choice, which is the case in these. So for each one of those questions, you can only select one of them, or you can do select all that apply option as well. And you can either do a single question or you can do multiple questions at the same time, which is what we have here.
So then, as this is going, one of the things that you want to be cognizant of, and this is very difficult, at least I find it's very difficult to do, is really looking for that response and dealing with the awkward amount of time that you're going to be waiting for people to respond. With polling, it's a little bit easier, and I'll show you why. As that poll is going, the hosts are receiving immediate responses to see at which point they are filling it out. And I believe, Andrew, you said that does come pretty quickly.
It's instantaneous.
Now, the hard part is, like I said, when you're doing this and waiting for the response, every second seems like an eon. So in the past, some of the things that I've done is really set a timer on my phone that's next to me just to know how much time is going. And if I say it's going to take 30 seconds, really be brave and just stick it out for the 30 seconds. 30 seconds seems like 5 minutes in a webinar. But it's useful and needed in terms to make the activities relevant. So what I'd like you to do is, just thinking about your own webinar, take a couple minutes and write into the chat at least one objective for your webinar. And then the hard part, I want you to try to think about one activity you might do during the webinar. And it doesn't have to be very specific. It could be as simple as having people answer in a chat, or using a Zoom tool, or any other type of activity. And we'd like to just go through and read some of the objectives and see some of the things that you might plan to do as an activity as you go through your webinar. So I'll sit and wait just about 2 minutes as you're composing your ideas and typing into the chat. We have a small group with us today, so might call on a couple of people just to talk about that, some of their plans, if you don't mind. So the breakout rooms are great. Just experienced my first breakout room, and it really is, it's a nice way to get that engagement between the participants, which you don't typically get in a webinar, and it's easy to control, you know, in terms of getting the right number of people and focusing on a specific plan. Laura, if you don't mind, I would love for you to unmute if you could and talk about what you mean by a call to action.
So I think Laura said that she doesn't have a microphone.
That's okay, that's fine. Great. So one of the things we want to think about as you're developing this, and this is one of the things you really can't control for in terms of the critical mass, is how many people will be participating in your webinar. So as you're developing your goals and you're developing your activities, really think about plan 2. What if you don't have the critical mass, and will that activity still be useful? And if not, what could you jump to immediately following that? Oh, great. So Laura, looking at like an individual action plan for the participant to develop right on the spot. Great. Excellent. Now, Andrew, how much work goes into the breakout rooms?
Not a ton. So the breakout rooms can either be predefined, so you can specifically group people if you know how you want to break them up and that kind of thing. So you can assign people, or you can randomly assign people equally into different rooms, and then they'll just automatically go into their rooms by clicking one more link. And then once you close all the rooms to bring them back to the main webinar rooms, it just happens automatically from the host side.
Right.
So it's just a part of the Zoom system, because in our situation, we use Zoom meetings and not Zoom webinars. And so because it's a meeting space, we have the ability to do the breakout rooms.
So Barbara has a good question in the range of participants typically for the topical webinars in terms of numbers.
It totally depends. It really depends. For example, the NGSS webinars typically get registrations of upwards of like 150, and they do a lot of good promotion in terms of hitting a lot of different listservs that they're connected with. And they get, and then generally for webinars, you have, if you have 150, maybe you get 50 people to actually show up that for the webinar itself. But then we've had other ones that are 15 people, 20 people, some really small ones. It really depends on certainly the topic, but also the advertisement to the specific groups that are going to really want to be able to have the interest in the topic.
Laura, I think you brought up a great point in terms of the small step people can put into place right away. And that's a really important takeaway for any of the webinars or workshops. A lot of times we can tend to overwhelm participants. So any way we can to give them that opportunity to find that one piece that they can take and immediately put into place, I think is critical in terms of creating a successful webinar. That's great. Excellent. Find my way back here. There we go. So in terms of our best practices, just looking at how we're going to put all this together, the general idea is really taking this from NAGT's best practices for workshops and trying to put this into a webinar standpoint and really looking at those same practices, but removing anything that's really going to look at how the individual is going to interact for a longer period of time. When we look at this page, I've tried to take out those best practices that are best fit for webinars, really looking at that active engagement, right? That came up as the biggest word that we had in that word cloud, is really being interactive, keeping people engaged throughout as much as possible. And I think we all said that in the room, nothing's deadlier where you don't participate and you're just listening and not thinking through what we're going to be doing or how we're going to put what you learn into practice. So really just trying the best that you can to model that effective pedagogy in a webinar. And that really is the difficult part, because you don't have that one-on-one interaction that you do in the workshop setting, where you see the immediate feedback and in this case, trying to juggle between video, a slide, and possibly a chat or other interactions. In all cases, we really do, just going back to that idea of being able to put something in place immediately. And that really means emphasizing all of the practical applications. So really honing in on the most practical parts of your objective and getting folks to understand exactly how they can use that immediately in their class. As you move through this list, I've tried to put those things that are going to have more difficulty, I would say, putting it into your webinar. And that starts with, providing materials and examples. And we want to do that to the best that we can, but it gets a little difficult in a webinar situation. Providing the materials, number one, it's hard for any participants to go between applications. So if we want people to navigate to another website, just be cognizant of that might cause difficulties coming back to the webinar and locating the materials. And we'll talk about some ways of mitigating that in just a second. In terms of the participants, what we want to try to do to the best of our ability, and it's not always as easy in every topic or every webinar, is really providing time for the participants to make progress on a task, right? Being able to walk away with saying, I know this is what I am going to do. And that really comes down to that idea of an IAP, right? An individual action plan, and how they're going to take the information that they gained from your webinar and really put it to practice right away. And then lastly, of course, making sure they leave the workshop with specific plans on what they're going to do moving forward. So as you leave this workshop, hoping you'll have a better idea of how you might use some of the tools or some of these ideas in your own workshop, and understanding how they might be better a fit in one area or another. Just reading some of the chats. So the question is, can you communicate with participants or registrants prior to the workshop? And it's a great question. I think that's a difficult thing, but what we'll talk about in just a second is how you might be able to use the webinar website to kind of get some of that information out. So before we get to that part, just focusing everybody's attention to the webinar that you're going to produce. Once again, just a second, if you could get back to the poll EV. And I'm just going to move to our next, here we go, and get that started. And what I'd like you to do is just think about the things that are going to be most challenging for you as you get together the materials you need for your webinar and start planning. Just some words, again, just in the poll, just to see where your thoughts are and how we might be able to calm some of those thoughts. So I'll give everybody a minute to navigate to that same location. So time and timing, that's the big one, really, for all of us. Finding the time always means that in the technology coming up rather large. Technology is always going to be the hindrance, especially when you're starting to do more difficult tasks in terms of getting your participants active. One of the things you want to think about in terms of the technology is just remember not every activity scales well to a webinar. Some things that might go over really well in a classroom or a workshop setting that uses technology, as you start to bring in the internet and the disparate locations of all of the participants, that does become a little bit of a problem. Even in this case, when we use poll everywhere, we ran into problems, and thankfully we were able to work through those out and get this running. This is great. Interaction, timing, discussions, useful. So the nice part about looking at this is as soon as we start developing anything, if we can just focusing on what we know is going to be a challenge to begin with, these are the things that we really want to pay the most attention to in the most amount of time leading up to that. So we're not rushing at the end to put this material together and making sure everything goes well. On that note, just be aware, things technically can go wrong, and we just got to be willing to work through those challenges and hopefully have a backup plan as you move on. Good. This is great. So as you do this, these are the same, just so everybody's aware, these are the same things that come up time and time again. It doesn't matter if we're talking about putting together a curriculum in a class, an activity in a class, or even a workshop. The problems are always going, the challenging items are always going to be a challenge, and really just taking the time and making sure you reach out to those who can help, and whether that's going to be the webinar committee members that first approached you, NAGT staff, or other technical pieces. Just know that there's always somebody there to help you work out some of those resources. So Laura is tracking the chat box during a webinar is a challenge. It definitely is. As you can see, if you haven't noticed, my eyes are in many locations just working through this webinar, making sure we're keeping right on the screen and then checking to see if there are any questions moving on. It's definitely a difficult situation. And if you're having a co-presenter, that's one of the things that you might do leading up to your webinar, is just really figure out those roles. While somebody's talking, somebody else can be also looking at that chat box and making sure to bring up relevant information throughout the presenting period.
And I'll jump in there and say, if it's a webinar that has, like if you have a guest person as the presenter, whoever the webinar leaders commonly they'll mind the chat box, and usually beforehand there's a discussion about how questions are going to be handled during the webinar. So some people will take questions on the fly like Sean is doing, but other people will kind of maybe keep to them or queue up the questions for various stopping points. Maybe you have the webinar broken up into 2 sections or 3 sections, or all at the end or something like that. So there's ways to do that, and it definitely helps to have a second pair of eyes watching the chat box, but some type of protocol to be able to kind of jump in if you are going to take questions on the fly.
So as we're getting to this, just thinking ahead in terms of how you're going to basically not only just develop, but also publicize and market your webinar. You want to be able to draw an audience, and part of that is just thinking ahead, which sections, which divisions, which groups of people are you most likely to draw from your specific topic. And then to maximize your participants, start thinking about how you could draw in other areas and how your topic might be interested to other areas of NAGT or outside groups. On that note, think about how you might reach out to some of those divisions or section leaders just to say, hey, we're putting this webinar together and you might want to let your division or section know that this is happening. In either case, as you develop the summary for your description of your webinar, think about how people will read that and whether or not the language you're using is really going to draw on the groups that you're hoping to attract. So as you're going through and you've got your groups in mind, who you're going to contact, who might be interested just based on your discussion, think about how you might now maximize some of those best practices in terms of engaging your audience, keeping, appealing to the effective domain, keeping them interested, and really making sure that your webinar is going to provide them something long lasting that they're going to use in the future in their class and hopefully immediately. And then the last but not least part is just remember that as we're doing this, this is a lasting record. All webinars are recorded, no pressure, right? But it is being recorded. So practice as many times as possible. It's interesting as you go through this process, trying to think about the things we're not used to. So before everybody jumped on, Andrew and I were looking at the lag between what I was doing here in my office versus what was showing up on screen, and something we just don't think about too often. But there is that possibility where you might be talking about something that's not showing up. So as soon as you can start practicing, the better that really comes across, and especially if you can practice across the Zoom platform, just to make sure everything's running smoothly. So things that were challenging for me putting this together is just basically what we said earlier. You don't know who's coming, right? It could be 4 people, it could be 9, it could be 30. They could be from all areas of NAGT. They're all experiences in terms of building workshops, developing workshops, leading them. It's really difficult, and just compounding that an hour is a short amount of time, and then if we're taking the time for discussion and evaluation, it becomes even shorter. So as you're going through this, really getting that balance between learning, applying becomes really difficult. Even for this webinar, it's going to be probably more challenging if you have an in-depth topic that you'll be covering. But it's something we want to think about beforehand. So one question, are the chat and breakout rooms recorded? I don't know about the breakout rooms. I don't believe the chats are recorded. Andrew, you can talk more on that.
So I'll actually flip it on you. Chats are recorded.
Okay.
We actually can download those. Breakout rooms are not recorded. So that's one of the deals with that, is that the breakout rooms are not recorded. The main room would always still be recorded, but not the individual sessions. And so Barb's asking whether or not chats in the breakout rooms are recorded. And I think that is a possibility, because there is a chat within there. And if it's not recorded by the end, you can certainly save them before everyone leaves the room, because we've definitely done that before. So that I do believe it can be captured. And then there was also a question about what the most common technical glitches are.
I could think of one is sound. Right, so depending on what you're doing, if the sound's not coming through, for instance, Andrew and I practiced this yesterday, and the sound on all those videos was perfectly fine for me. I tested it beforehand, the sound was fine, but then when the videos played here, I didn't hear anything. So that was difficult in trying to figure out what was happening when. Also, if you have any outside programs that you're using, things go wrong quickly in terms of a webinar. So you want to make sure they're practiced quite well.
Yeah, I think the practice is kind of the key point of all of that, and practicing exactly in the setting that you plan on doing the webinar.
Yep.
Because most of the technical issues mostly come down to the network connection and whether or not the screen goes pixelated or the sound gets off because it doesn't have the bandwidth. With the Zoom, it's actually been really easy than other versions of video conferencing. It's all pretty seamless for the most part, and mostly it comes down to once you have the presentation, do you have videos in there? We kind of know what things to look for. If you do have videos in there, if you are doing polls, we know what some of the common places where things might get tripped up, and we can kind of deal with all of those at the practice discussion.
So in terms of making the webinars interactive, the Zoom tools are actually quite useful. You have a couple of options that are really quick and easy, whether it's raising your hand or yes and no type responses. It's really quick. You get a nice visual right away. So in the participant list, you can see immediately how many people are answering, and it's just immediate feedback. Polling in Zoom works really well. So you can do some of those multiple choice type responses from the participants relatively easily. It does take some degree of setup prior to, but it's simple. And the chat, as you can see here, it allows us all to speak and really get some a little bit more in depth in terms of the follow through with questions or answers. As you start moving beyond that, think again about using the webinar webpage. You can go in and if there are any pages or PDFs that you want your participants have, you can link to them directly from the webinar page, and Andrew would help set that up for you. I'm assuming, Andrew, you'd have to make sure of copyrights on that one, but you can speak to that.
I mean, yep, copyright's always for anything. But yeah, if in terms of pre-webinar communication, right, you all got an email that had the connection information, and so we could add whatever details you want in that communication.
And then, you know, as you saw just through this, there are other web resources. I used Poll Everywhere. Some people have used Google Docs, Kahoot. Just remember, they're not always easily scaled. Even in this case, Poll Everywhere, you don't see it from your end, but I'm actually operating on 3 different devices just to make that happen, which becomes troublesome, right? So you're really trying to really work hard on getting all of that through. So there's a question about making live webinars ADA accessible. Is that something we need to address? So Andrew, I believe all webinars are closed captioned.
Yeah, there's not a captioning option in real time, but the recordings are all captioned after the fact and posted with webinars. It's something that Zoom hasn't quite caught up with yet. And I think everyone is trying to figure out how to address that.
And then one thing to be careful about, and this is just something that is, you know, I've had struggles with, if you have your participants go out to another platform, whether it's just off on the internet, sometimes it is difficult to navigate back to the Zoom platform. So you just want to allow for that and make sure people are comfortable and come back to are able to get back to where they need to be. So just putting things together and really finalizing, when you're developing your website, you're going to be working with Andrew to get the webinar website up. If you have questions about the actual program, specifics about your idea, work with the committee members, especially the committee member that reached out to you. All of us would be willing, ready and willing to help you develop your ideas and assist you in any way that we can to make the webinar a great webinar and workshop, as all NAGT programs are. And then, of course, don't forget all NAGT events, whether they're webinars or workshops or field trips. We expect all participants and presenters to abide by the code of conduct. And I know I don't have to worry about that for any of the participants today. Just remember that all NAGT events, try to be as inclusive as possible and make sure everybody is welcomed throughout the entire program. And with that, just letting you know some of our upcoming webinars. The next webinar, Teaching About Volcanoes with Kaja Kraft and UNAVCO on January 29th. And then on-ramps, hopefully you'll have some ideas, that is coming on February 6th. And I'll leave the questions. And if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat box. And in the meantime, please click on the webinar survey to fill out the evaluation. I hope everybody got something from the webinar, understands a little of the processes of developing, and hopefully avoids some of the technical issues that might be in there, and continues to make this program and series a great series for NAGT. I think one of the greatest things about NAGT is really understanding it's not just an organization, it's a brand, and the things that come out of this organization are just incredible. And I know it's all due to the people who present these workshops. So thank you for joining us. And at that point, I'll take any questions.